Okay, so I've got my hair back, I've got my rings and bracelets off, I've got my apron. So here we are. So this is the powder table. Everything that you need to mix clay is already back here. So the only thing that you need to bring is yourself, and then if you want to grab an apron, okay? Otherwise, you should never bring any other tools, anything else back here, okay? So this is the dry powder. We've got sifters, we've got plastic pieces. Before I even get into getting my liquefied clay, I'm gonna prepare my area. I took this morning to kind of clean up the table. It was not looking as nice at the beginning of the day, but I cleaned it up. This is ideal, okay? So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna clear my area. Sometimes like over here, there's a bunch of chunks of clay. You just wanna make sure you have a nice clear area. We want our clay to be really nice and soft and consistent throughout, so we don't want those chunks of dry clay. So I'm gonna scrape away, clear my area, and then I'm gonna take the sifter and I'm gonna dip into the dry powder, and I'm just gonna sift a little bit down there, okay? So then I'm gonna pull out, we are using white clay, okay? For right now, we are only worried about white clay, so everybody will mix the white clay. So just make sure you are paying attention to that. And even though it's white clay, it's actually kind of gray before it goes through the kiln. So we're gonna dip in. It's a lovely experience. It's literally clay mixed with water. Okay, so liquefied clay is slip. So I'm gonna dip in and I'm gonna kind of let the water, the excess water, drip off of it. Okay, try to keep the barrel close to the table. We don't want slip on the floor because then the floor gets slippery. Oops. And carefully put it on the table, okay? You don't wanna just flop it down there or the powder is going to go up into the air, and we don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to let it drain again. You don't want a ton of clay. I would say what I'm mixing today is about where you want to be. The more clay that you mix, the longer it takes and the harder it is to get it consistent throughout. So I would say that is a pretty good amount, okay? So you can see this is where we start to get messy. Couple things to tell you. Actually, I'm going to tell you them later. So wherever you are, you can move the slip barrel. It's on wheels. So don't like be over here and then carry a handful of slip all the way to the other table. Move the slip barrel just so that we're not getting slip all over the floor like I just did. Okay. So what we need to do, we need to add dry powder into this so that it can start. Obviously, I can't make anything with this right now. It's way too goopy. It would not be workable at all. So I need to start adding the powder. So I'm gonna grab my sifter and I'm gonna start sifting over. At the beginning of mixing clay, you need a lot of powder, okay? Because it's really, really ooey gooey right now. The reason we use the sifters is because there are chunks from other people mixing clay that get into the powder. We don't want that in our clay. If we have these hard chunks in our clay, you can imagine if you're trying to make something and all of a sudden you've got this in your clay, that's gonna be a problem. So that's why we use the sifters. Guess what we can do with the chunks? Where do you think I'm gonna put them? Back in the, you're right. What's the word? What's this called? Liquefied clay. Slip. So these are called the slip barrels. So, cool thing about ceramics, as long as clay has not gone through the kiln, it can be recycled back into the slip barrel. So these are essentially just hardened pieces of clay. They're not workable anymore. If I put them back into the slip barrel, they're gonna turn back into slip. So the water's gonna break down that hard clay and turn it back into slip. So anytime that you end up with hard chunks in your sifter, carefully put them back into the slip barrel. Now we don't want to dump them from up here and splash everyone. Nobody wants to be splashed by the slip barrel. So just kind of make sure that you carefully dump them, okay? So at first, it's going to be really difficult to incorporate and wedge the clay. So another term you're going to hear me say a lot is wedge. Wedging, think about kneading. Wedging, kneading can kind of be used hand in hand. So I'm going to really carefully kind of fold the powder in. Okay, and as soon as it's incorporated, so already my powder has kind of gone away, I'm going to add more. So at the beginning of mixing clay, you need a lot of powder, okay? And this is where your hands get really messy. Okay, so I'm going to continue to sift, lots of powder, and then I'm going to very carefully kind of start to fold it in. Okay, so this is the process at the beginning, and then once it starts to get a little bit more solid and a little bit more plastic, we'll be able to actually wedge it a little bit better. Okay, so as soon as that powder seems to be incorporated, I'm going to sift some more. Okay, and when my sifter seems to be just the chunks, I'm going to carefully put those back in the bin. Okay. And at the beginning, you don't want to slap your hands down on your slip. We really don't want the powder up in the air. It's really not good for us to breathe in. So just be very careful that you don't do anything that would make the powder kind of poof up into the air, okay? Again, my powder is pretty much incorporated into my pile of slip. So I'm going to add more powder. Okay, so it's definitely a process. Once we get it starting to be a little bit more solid, it's going to be a little easier. Okay, so already it's starting to be more of a solid piece rather than a pile of slip. As soon as you can kind of pick it up as one piece, I'm going to pick it up, kind of gather the little chunks. I'm going to carefully pick it up, and I'm also going to put powder underneath my area because that'll kind of get it from the top and the bottom so that it'll form into plastic clay a little bit quicker. And again, carefully set it down. We don't want the powder to poof up into the air. Okay, so I'm gonna put those chunks back in the slip barrel. I'm gonna keep on going. So once it starts to be a little bit more solid, we can actually wedge it or knead it. And as it does get more solid, you really want to make sure that you are wedging it well because we want the powder to get all throughout. We don't want it to just be good on the outside. We want it to be good throughout the whole thing. So really wedge it as it starts to get more solid. Keep adding the powder. And we're just going to keep wedging until it gets to be really nice and plastic and workable, okay? So what you don't want to do is just like that, because if you're just doing that, it's only really getting powder on the outside. You really want to make sure that you're wedging it and kneading it so that that powder incorporates throughout the whole thing, okay? So I'm going to keep doing this. As I'm doing this, you can direct your attention up to that poster, and we're going to talk about clay mixing do's and don'ts. This is also in your packet, so if you need to review, you can look at those as well. So things that I do want to see as you are mixing clay. You're going to mix clay whenever you need to. So obviously right now, everybody needs it. It's going to be pretty busy back here for the next few days. I do build in a couple extra working days on this first project, so even if you're the very last person to mix clay, you should still be able to get your project done on time, okay? SRT is a great place to come mix clay so that you're not taking away from project work time. Again, this first project, I build in extra time so that everyone can mix, but SRT is always a great opportunity to mix clay, okay? So mix it whenever you need to. So obviously everyone needs it now, but from here on out, maybe your clay lasts you through the second project, so you don't have to mix clay for a while. Maybe your clay only lasts you through part of the first project, so you're going to be mixing clay a little bit sooner. So you never have to ask. As long as I'm not doing a demo or doing a presentation, you guys are always allowed to come back here and mix clay, okay? Make sure that you mix in small quantities to get better consistency. So what I'm doing right now is a pretty good amount. I always have the kid that wants to mix like a giant amount of clay so that they don't have to mix clay as often. It will take you forever because to get it nice and consistent, it'll just take a really long time, and it'll probably dry out before you can use it all. So although that sounds great, it's not usually, it doesn't usually work out very well. So you could go a little bit larger than what I have, but I would not mix a giant piece of clay, okay? Next one, make sure that you're putting hard lumps back in the slip barrel, okay? We don't want those hard lumps all over the table. It makes it difficult for everyone else. And we want to make sure that we use the sifter so that we don't get those hard lumps into our nice plastic piece of clay. Make sure you come in for SRT if you need to so you don't get behind on your project. We already addressed that. Okay, so things that I don't want to see. Powder should never leave the wedging table. Literally the only thing that the powder is used for is to make clay. It's not used for anything else. So I never want to see you taking the powder away from the table. Again, as I said before, it's not something that we want to be breathing in, so we want to try to keep it concentrated in one area of the room so that it's not getting everywhere in the air, okay? If you have a situation where you mixed clay, you thought it was good, but then as you start to work with it, you find that it's still pretty sticky and soft, you can always come back here with your chunk of clay to put more powder in it, but you just never want to take the powder away from the table, okay? Next one, do not throw clay down on the mixing table. I addressed that already. The general feeling of all of these is we want to keep the powder on the table. We don't want it up in the air. We don't want it away from this table, okay? Let's see. As far as getting a new bag of powder, because obviously I'm using the powder, it's going to deplete itself. Make sure that you just tell me if we need another bag. I expect that when we do get a new bag, the table is pretty clean. We don't have a bunch of chunks everywhere. You can kind of see what happens as I mix clay. The powder kind of spreads itself out. So what I like to do from time to time is just take the plastic pieces and kind of gather everything back. Okay, back into the middle. So then I've got a nicer pile to kind of scoop from, and it's keeping the table clean so that it's easier for people to mix clay, okay? So whenever we need a new bag, I'll come back here and check everything, and then I will get you a new bag of powder whenever we need it. Don't give me the excuse that you don't have a project done because you had to wait to mix clay. Come in for SRT. Don't splash the hard clay lumps in the slip barrel. We addressed that. If the slip barrel seems really full, don't continue to fill it because we have to kind of move it around the table. We don't want it splashing everywhere. So if the slip barrel is really full and you need to put something in it, just say, hey, Mrs. Fowler, slip barrel is really full. Where can I put this? Okay. Never have any tools near the slip barrels. Like I said at the beginning, everything that you need to mix clay is already over here. So we don't want to bring any tools. Some of the tools that we'll be using are fairly sharp. If they got hidden in the powder or if they fell into the slip barrel and then someone goes to grab, that's not going to be fun. So absolutely no tools should ever be over here. And never put anything except for clay in the slip barrel. So you've seen me put the clay lumps or the powder lumps back in the slip barrel. I said that they recycle back into slip. As long as clay has not gone through the kiln, it will recycle back into slip. So let's say you've got this piece of clay. Maybe you accidentally left your bag open over the weekend and your clay chunk got really, really hard. It's not workable. You can't use it. You can't build a project with it. What do you think you can do with it? Put it back in the slip barrel, okay? So it hasn't been fired in the kiln. It can go back in the slip barrel and it will turn back into slip and somebody else can kind of reuse that clay. Let's say you have a project. Every project, I am going to grade it before it goes into the kiln. So I grade it after you're done building, but before it goes in the kiln. So I've graded it and you're thinking to yourself, man, I had trouble with this project. This was not my project. I don't like it. I don't want it. What do you think you can do with it? Put it back in the slip barrel. Yep. So because I grade before it goes in the kiln, if you decide that you're just not feeling it, put it back in the slip barrel. It's already graded, okay? The only thing that cannot go in the slip barrel is anything that has gone through the kiln. So my tiles that I showed you up there, those have been through the kiln. If I put those in the slip barrel, they would stay exactly like that. And every year we find some fired clay in the slip barrel, and it literally just stays as is. So we don't want to put that in the slip barrel because it doesn't break down, okay? And obviously the only thing that we want to put in here is unfired clay, and just make sure that you're paying attention to which slip barrel. There are 4 different slip barrels. They are all different colors of clay. So we want to make sure that we're putting in the white slip barrel, okay? All right, it's a workout, guys. So we're at the point where my clay is obviously much better. It's not a slip slop pile. I can pick it up. It feels pretty workable. There is a point where you can put too much powder. So right now, it kind of looks like the surface of my clay is cracking. It's really just the powder sitting on the surface and kind of soaking in a little bit. But when I actually kind of push into my clay, it's still really soft. If you are wedging and your clay is just crumbling apart and it's not staying together as a chunk, you may have put too much powder in it, okay? If you put too much powder in it and it gets too hard, what do you think the next step is? Put it back in the slip barrel. So you do want to pay attention. I would say that it's harder to go too far than most kids don't mix enough powder in. But if it's crumbling apart, not staying together, you've probably gone too far. Okay, so just kind of take note as you're wedging your clay, and just try not to go that far. There's no perfect consistency. I like my clay how I like my clay. You might like your clay a little bit softer, a little bit harder. So you would kind of just have to experiment at first. That's why with this first project, I'm not teaching you any really hard building techniques, because I kind of just want you to get used to the clay. So if you think it's good, you know, it feels pretty solid. When I push into it, I don't turn into Swamp Thing anymore. It feels like it's pretty good. As you start working with it, if you then feel like it is kind of still too sticky, you can always come back here and add more. The other thing that you can do, which I'll do this a lot, I'm okay with my big chunk being kind of soft because it'll last longer, but I just need this little piece. So maybe I'm just gonna bring this little piece back and wedge a little bit more powder into that piece so that this piece is ready to work with, but then my chunk is still staying really soft so it'll last longer, okay? So you kind of just have to experiment at first and kind of see how you like your clay, okay? So at this point, I've wedged as much of that outside powder in as I can, and I feel like my clay is pretty good. I'm gonna put these last chunks in. If you are the last person or the last few people at the table, at the end of the period, the expectation is that the lid goes on the slip barrel slides back under the table. So that's one of the things that I'm always gonna be looking for at the end of the period. So I'm gonna slide that back over, and then I'm gonna take this over here. Okay, so over here, we've got a piece of canvas. Clay does not stick to canvas because it is fabric, and so you can use this canvas and you kind of push little chunks away to get the rest of that powder that you couldn't get wedged in to be wedged in. And then I'm going to cut it. So I'm going to use this piece of wire and I'm just going to cut my clay in half. Okay, so what am I looking for? I'm looking for consistency, okay? So we want essentially this whole piece to look exactly the same. If you have pockets of slip, you probably want to wedge a little bit better, wedge a little bit harder. If you have hard chunks, definitely get them out. And then I do have a little air pocket here. Okay, little tiny air pocket in my chunk of clay is okay. If you have a bunch of air pockets, you know that you probably want to wedge it quite a bit better before you actually start working, because air pockets cause explosions in the kiln. Okay, so mine's good. I'm gonna wedge it back together real quick. And then in this cabinet, we have bags. Obviously, we want to put our clay in a bag because if it dries out, we can't use it anymore. So I'm gonna grab a bag. I'm going to check it. What do you think I'm checking for? Holes. We don't want any holes. If you have little tiny holes, I have tape up behind my desk that you're welcome to use. If it's a big gaping hole, just toss it, okay? So I'm gonna put my clay in. I'm gonna get all the air out. I'm gonna twist it. And then this can go in your shelf space. Obviously, if you were ready to work on a project, you could just go ahead and start working with it, okay? Hands have clay all over them, okay? We're gonna go to the sink. I'm gonna go to the sink right here. Make sure that you are washing over, you can turn it off now.